Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to completely transform the dense, rule-heavy narrative of Israel's wilderness wanderings into a totally captivating story of redemption. Look, if you've ever felt bogged down reading the ancient laws and those endless journey logs of the Old Testament, well, you are definitely not alone. But today, we're going to see how all these events form a brilliant, beautifully designed survival manual that points directly to the ultimate rescue mission. Let's dive right in by mapping out the big picture. Our whole historical story here spans roughly 40 years. We're moving from the miraculous Exodus in 1446 BC straight to the foot of Mount Sinai, where the book of Leviticus was written around 1445 BC, all the way down to 1406 BC, right as a brand new generation stands on the very edge of the Promised Land. To guide us safely through all this material, here's our roadmap. We'll hit the wilderness timeline, Sinai and the covenant, the 5 offerings, shadows of the cross, the 40-year delay, and finally, entering the promise. Okay, let's kick things off with section 1, the wilderness timeline and setting the stage. There's this saying that just perfectly captures the central theme of the book of Numbers, and it goes like this. It took 40 hours to get Israel out of Egypt, but 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. Their physical escape from slavery, that was rapid. But their internal transformation was just a massive uphill struggle. I mean, they were a covenant people, totally redeemed from bondage, yet their mindset was still completely trapped back in Egypt, marked by this constant, endless pattern of grumbling and fear. Barely months into their journey, they arrive at Mount Sinai, where God establishes his covenant. And this brings us to section 2, Sinai and the covenant, and a massive divine dilemma. So the absolutely crucial point here is this central question. How can a holy God actually dwell in the midst of a sinful people? Think about it for a second. God's presence is described as a consuming fire. They've built the tabernacle and the glory of the Lord has literally filled it. But how do deeply flawed, rebellious people survive living next door to absolute perfection? Well, Leviticus is basically the ultimate survival manual for this exact predicament. You see, Leviticus commands total separation from sin. It makes it crystal clear that a sinful people desperately need a system of mediation and atonement just to survive God's presence. In fact, the word holy appears more than 150 times in this book, and it simply means separation. Because God is completely separate from sin, his people have to be too. But, since they obviously can't do this perfectly on their own, God graciously steps in and provides a solution. To solve this incredible problem, God establishes a highly specific sacrificial system right there at the foot of the mountain. That brings us to section 3, the 5 offerings and the solution at Sinai. This system builds a sort of mental map of 5 distinct offerings. And guys, these were the absolute only way to establish and maintain fellowship with God. Each one has a very specific purpose. The grain offering represents a perfect, sinless life presented to God. The peace offering was an actual shared meal, literally representing fellowship. The guilt offering was for sins that required a strict 20% restitution, really emphasizing that our wrongs have a tangible cost. But to really grasp the depth of what's happening here, we need to look a bit closer at the burnt and sin offerings. Now, these ancient rituals weren't just about animals. They bring us right into section 4, shadows of the cross, moving from shadow to substance, because these offerings were actually prophetic shadows pointing straight to Jesus Christ. This brilliantly illustrates our first major connection. The burnt offering was totally consumed in smoke, going completely up to God. It was what they called a sweet savor offering. And this perfectly prefigured Christ, whose absolute perfection and complete, sinless self-giving was entirely consecrated to the Father. He is that ultimate, total dedication that we could literally never achieve on our own. Furthermore, the sin and guilt offerings vividly prefigure how Jesus became our substitute. You see, the sin offering wasn't a sweet savor at all. It was all about bearing the heavy, ugly weight of sin. And notice this specific detail. The animal's carcass had to be taken and burned way outside the camp. The writer of Hebrews makes a direct connection to this later on, pointing out that Jesus suffered outside the gate of Jerusalem to bear the full cost of our sin. He literally took our place in the zone of rejection. Leviticus mentions the word atonement, or kafar in Hebrew, 45 times. 45! It drives home the relentless clarity that without the shedding of blood, there is absolutely no forgiveness of sins. In that ancient system, the blood of innocent animals temporarily covered the sins of the people. But it was always looking forward, anticipating the permanent, eternal covering secured by Christ's final sacrifice. So, armed with this incredible theological manual of grace and mediation, the Israelites resume their march toward their inheritance. But then, disaster strikes. Welcome to Section 5, the 40-year delay and the tragedy at Kadesh Barnea. To put this in perspective geographically, the journey from Horeb, which is just another name for Sinai, up to Kadesh Barnea was only about 200 miles. Heading north towards the Promised Land under normal circumstances, this was literally just an 11-day journey. They were right on the doorstep of their incredible inheritance. But instead of walking forward in faith, they walked right into a massive crisis. Despite God's constant visible presence in a pillar of cloud and fire, 10 of the 12 sent spies incited a huge rebellion. They came back absolutely terrified of the Anakim, the giants living in the land. They completely forgot the miraculous deliverance they had literally just experienced in Egypt. Only Joshua and Caleb stood firm, bravely declaring of the giants, "They are bread for us." But the people, they wept, they rebelled, and they flat out refused to go in. And because of that sheer unbelief and their refusal to trust the God who had just saved them, God handed down a severe, perfectly measured judgment. 40 days of spying translated directly into 40 years of wandering. 1 year for every single day they surveyed the land in doubt. It's a deeply, deeply sobering moment. This stark reality actually serves as the primary Old Testament background for the New Testament warnings we see later in the Bible. The lesson is crystal clear. Unbelief disqualifies you from the inheritance. They were redeemed from Egypt for sure, but they missed out on the promise because they simply wouldn't trust God to finish the job. Finally, after 38 long, grueling years of wandering, that rebellious generation passes away, and the timeline resumes its forward momentum in Section 6, entering the promise with the next generation. Fast forward to 1406 BC, and the new generation arrives on the plains of Moab. They are finally poised to cross the Jordan River under the leadership of Joshua. They're standing right across from Jericho, looking at the very land their parents were just too afraid to take. But here is what's truly amazing about this whole story. Even in the absolute depths of their wilderness wanderings, amidst all their failures and all those judgments, God continually provided grace and healing. At one point, when they were bitten by fiery serpents because of their complaining, God had Moses raise a bronze serpent on a pole. Anyone who just looked at it lived. Centuries later, Jesus himself cited this direct historical event as a perfect shadow of his own saving work on the cross. You just have to look to him in faith to be saved. Ultimately, the wilderness isn't just some piece of ancient geography. It mirrors our own walk. We too are living in that space between our redemption and our final inheritance. The historical failures and the incredibly beautiful shadows of Leviticus, they challenge us to look at our own lives. When you face the giants in your life, do you answer in faith or do you turn back in fear? Every single day is a choice. Will you trust the ultimate sacrifice or will you stay wandering in the desert? Keep exploring, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.